Listen very carefully and follow my instructions. Prepare your brain for the Live Cortex Nootropic Podcast.
Welcome to the Live Cortex Nootropics Podcast 006, my epic nootropics and smart drugs friends. This episode is going to be about one of my favorite neuromodulating compounds, one that's massively underrated but majorly historically present and continually effective for large groups of people over the years, and that is the epic Ginkgo biloba. We're going to talk about the mechanistic underpinnings of Ginkgo to explain why it's doing what it does. I want to explain my experience with this wonder nootropic herb over the last year, and I really want to help bring Ginkgo back to the forefront of the nootropics community for its neuroprotective and cognitive optimization abilities. We're going to talk about Ginkgo's abilities to affect dopamine and acetylcholine in the prefrontal cortex and striatum, and a lot more. But first, I want to quick mention a few things about the content that we're putting out here on Live Cortex that I think you guys should know. Number one, we've now made the Live Cortex podcast, this podcast, available on YouTube. So we'll be starting from episode 3 and we'll be caught up to episode 6 on YouTube in no time. So you can go to youtube.com, search for Live Cortex Nootropics Podcast, and you'll start to see the episodes pop up kind of in video format so that you can watch them on YouTube. Number 2, if you're listening to this on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, and if you're on iTunes, subscribe to the podcast there, and write us a review if you're so inclined. Number 3, we recently put out some content on cholinergic dominance, one of the major, interesting topics to me that having experimented with acetylcholine precursors over the years, I've really come to think is important, as well as optimizing the acetylcholine profile and maintenance doses of nootropics thereafter. So check out that content on livecortex.com or Google Live Cortex and some of those terms so you can find those posts. Also, on the blog, related to the last point there, on livecortex.com, you can subscribe to the email list to have all that content sent directly to your inbox. It's not like FeedBurner where it automatically just gets generated and sent each time we post a post. Instead, what's going to happen is at the end of the week or at the end of like a 7-day period or a long period of posting content within about a week or 2 week span, or probably the highest it'll go is 2 weeks, we'll send all of the content that was posted directly to your inbox. You don't get 100 emails a day or 100 emails a week, a bunch of emails a week. At the end of the week, you'll get an email with all the content that we put out, linking to all the individual blog posts and or podcasts and or YouTube videos. Because after all, who doesn't want epic smart drugs and nootropics content delivered right to their inbox? I totally do. Number 5, the Cortex Nootropic is out there killing it in the market, and it's helping a lot of people get a ton more productivity out of themselves, which makes me really happy. I'm going to read a review from a woman who lives in Ontario, Canada, that reached out to me to sample the product in its initial launch stages and has since bought a bottle and really loves the stack. Her name is Sophie Ayala, and here's what she has to say about Cortex. Ryan Michael Bella has created a superior nootropic in Cortex. After trying several of the different varieties of smart drugs out in the market, I was very impressed with Cortex. I was able to feel focused, alert, aware, and energized with no side effects or headaches, being a working mother of 2 young kids. I usually take caffeine pills to get me through the day. With Cortex, I was able to go to a spinning class. Congratulations on getting up and going to a spinning class right after work, and had plenty of energy to get me through the high-intensity class and to be back home to feed and bathe the kids. That is an epic review. Thank you so much, Sophie. It's been really wonderful talking with you, Sophie, and kind of interacting with you about nootropics and life and everything else we talk about on Facebook and Twitter. I really appreciate the review and the support you've given the product and what we're doing here all along. It's really solid stuff. So, if you haven't tried the Cortex Nootropic Stack, snag yourself a bottle at livecortex.com and see for yourself what all the fuss is about. Cortex is designed specifically to enhance dendrite and axon growth between nerve cells in the brain, as well as improving both the quantity of the acetylcholine neurotransmitter and increasing the density of its receptor sites. It also has a profoundly positive effect on the dopamine system, so you might find yourself epically motivated to get work done while taking it. That has been the reviews and the sort of sentiment about it among its users. All right, folks, the introductory babbling has ended. It's time to get into the podcast. Episode 006, all about Ginkgo, coming at you. I gotta tell you, having been an entrepreneur for 6 years, I will not go through the rest of my life without taking smart drugs. Aniracetam, piracetam, uridine monophosphate, Alcar, CDP choline. You can always have a better brain.
The Live Cortex Nootropic Podcast is about to begin.
Ginkgo biloba, ladies and gents. You know, it's funny because this is one of those commonly thought of herbs in the minds of non-nootropics users when you ask them if they know what nootropics are. You like start to explain to people that nootropics are chemicals or herbal agents that through various neurological mechanisms enhance brain functionality and performance. They sort of look at you for a second and abruptly go, like Ginkgo biloba? Yes, like Ginkgo biloba. Ginkgo is one of these herbs that people refer to as giving them mental energy, but it sort of gets lopped into the category of stimulants like caffeine because of that. And we're really looking at the mechanisms of action behind Ginkgo's magic on the brain, which we're going to talk about. It's far from being a mere stimulant. Ginkgo gets grouped into the enes, the caffeines, the taurines, the guaranas, other kind of herbs in that category. But I very muchly group it in with some of the big boy nootropics like aniracetam, uridine, CDP choline, and others, particularly because of the profound effect it has on my verbal fluency and my mental performance in general. To me, the effects of Ginkgo biloba are quite conspicuous in that within about 20 minutes, I feel virtually every facet of my brain working noticeably better. Immediately, I notice a substantial verbal fluency improvement that competes right up there with the best of them, like triacetyluridine, the Cortex Nootropic stack, even the Alpha Brain stack I used to take back in the day and always experienced a great degree of functional verbal recall. For the duration of the effects, which for me seem to last nearly all day, I feel a distinct dopamine response that really turns on my reward system functionality. It's pretty cool. I feel motivated to get work done. I feel excited about life. I'm able to more efficiently, almost effortlessly correlate my work with the rewards that come with my work, which is always awesome. It's easier to see the outcome. It's like I'm much more motivated to get there. And I really want to talk about in this podcast why I think that is. Let's just jump right into it. Ginkgo biloba has intrinsic compounds that may be partially responsible for this extra motivation in the form of the reward response optimization. These are called flavonoids, these intrinsic compounds. Flavonoids are merely a kind of polyphenol that exists in high quantities in plants and definitely in Ginkgo biloba. There are 20 types of flavonoids in the Ginkgo plant, but I think that there are 3 major ones that might be at play here. I'm going to try to pronounce them, so if I butcher them, please don't butcher me. The first one is quercetin, second one is camphorol, and the third one is isohamnitin. These are the 3 major flavonoids that I think are responsible for some of the effects that I laid out above. One of them, or perhaps all of them, appear to increase dopamine concentrations in the prefrontal cortex of experimental rats. This was measured 40 to 180 minutes after oral ingestion, where dopamine levels shot up shockingly high at 85 to 134% above baseline. It's pretty darn impressive if you ask me. It's important to note that this was not after a single oral dose, though, but rather subchronically dosing for about 2 weeks. So it might be wise not to expect those effects right away, but continue dosing with Ginkgo and you're going to be right up that alley. There's also a minor increase in dopamine in the striatum, which is why this is so interesting and why this might contribute to this sort of reward system functionality, because the striatum has a lot to do with the reward system functionality of the brain. Very impressive stuff. It also has a neuroprotective effect on dopaminergic neurons that is quite impressive. So all this stuff might explain the pretty instant surge of motivation I get when taking Ginkgo biloba. And by the way, I've been taking it for months on and off, so I'm way past that initial period where dopamine levels don't get affected. And I really can't say what that period is for people. I mean, in this experimental study where we talked about dopamine concentrations rising up to 134% above baseline, that was rats, and so people are definitely going to be different, and so your mileage will certainly vary. But the question in my mind, one of the questions in my mind when I was really started to research Ginkgo biloba, understanding how it affected my brain, is what about the plant makes it so that when I take it, I'm a lot more verbally fluent? That was one of my primary interest in researching this wonderful chemical, because to me, verbal fluency is a great baseline factor in overall brain performance functionality. I mean, like if one has the capacity to fluently access and use their vocabulary to form sentences well, then the rest of their brain is likely working pretty good. I always use that as a sort of baseline. And for me, I always know, wait a minute, like the judge for how my brain is working right now is verbal fluency. Am I verbally fluent or not? All right, I'm in. Great, I'm in. I'm not. Okay, I need to work on it. So in researching this compound further, I discovered that it's also slightly cholinergic, which would explain some of the verbal fluency benefits I get from it. Every compound that's cholinergic, whether it's aniracetam, alpha brain, or the Cortex Nootropic stack, I always notice improvements in verbal fluency as a result of taking it. And also, by the way, just like most of the racetams, Ginkgo biloba is actually neuroprotective of amnesia induced by scopolamine, which is a cholinergic antagonist, which is pretty epic nootropic of the great herb. The cholinergic nature of Ginkgo biloba seems to be partially due to a preservation of acetylcholine signaling, as well as the acylated flavonoid glycosides within the compound, increasing acetylcholine concentrations in the prefrontal cortex. It's also been noted that Ginkgo may directly inhibit acetylcholine esterase, which is an enzyme in the brain that essentially takes acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter, breaks it down, and then puts it back into circulation for reuse, but it doesn't sort of continue firing it through other neurons. So essentially inhibiting this enzyme acetylcholine esterase provides the brain with more circulating acetylcholine. While that's a fairly minor effect on acetylcholine esterase, the combination of inhibiting acetylcholine esterase and preserving acetylcholine function should be enough to notice subjective functionality improvements that may be related to the cholinergic improvements brought on by the plant. Now, if all of that wasn't enough, in vitro, which by the way is just a fancy word for describing an experiment done outside of a living animal or plant, typically done in like a test tube, hence the commonly known name that gets prepared with it, called test tube experiments, attached to the vitro name. There's a substance called bilobalide that appears to promote neuronal regenesis, which would facilitate regular cognitive benefits and make you function good kind of at baseline, but also potential nerve repair as well. And that's what neuronal regenesis really means, nerve repair. Check this out. Amyloid beta, which is a group of peptides of amino acid that are pretty stunningly involved in Alzheimer's disease, is the main component of the amyloid plaques that underlie the disease itself and are found at large levels in the brain of people suffering with Alzheimer's. In vitro, neuronal losses induced by the B-amyloid protein, get this, are fully prevented by the bilobalide. Here's something else pretty interesting. This also took place with 100 milligrams per kilogram of body weight of Ginkgo biloba in vivo, which is with a live animal or human. In this case, it was a mouse. So when I said that this was a pretty impressive nootropic before that I think is like widely underrated and totally underestimated and should be brought back to the forefront of the nootropics community, I wasn't kidding. I mean, just to summarize what we just talked about. Number one, Ginkgo has the ability to increase dopamine concentrations in the prefrontal cortex and striatum. The striatum is a critical component to the reward system of the brain. Number two, Ginkgo has a protective effect on acetylcholine signaling functionality, increases acetylcholine concentrations in the prefrontal cortex, and has a slight effect on inhibiting an enzyme that breaks acetylcholine down, thus having more circulating acetylcholine in the brain. Number three, the plant is neuroprotective, like some of the popular racetams, and relieves scopolamine-induced amnesia. Number four, it has neuronal regenesis abilities, or the ability to help the brain repair itself at large scale in the form of nerve repair. And number five, the bilobalide compound in Ginkgo completely prevents the B-amyloid protein from inducing neuronal loss in test tube experiments and in live rodents. It's definitely time to rethink Ginkgo's nootropic classification. Looking at all of those benefits that we laid out above, one of the things that I think is responsible, at least partially, for some of those benefits is the fact that Ginkgo biloba is a vasodilator. The class of vasodilators, essentially what they do is increase and improve blood flow circulating through the brain, specifically by dilating or opening up blood vessels. The literal definition of dilate is make or become wider, larger, or more open, and that is what Ginkgo does to blood vessels. It's sort of interesting, right? Through my years experimenting with meditation and nootropics, I've always kind of tried to find nootropics that help me to experience the same kind of effect or induce the same kind of effect that I can get via meditation. And one of the interesting things about meditation that has been really helpful for me, that I think really contributes at least partially to some of the major profound effects that I get mentally when I meditate, is in fact the improved blood flow to the prefrontal cortex and to other areas of the brain. I'm going to read the conclusion of an abstract, which I'll link to below so that you can really get into it. Basically summing it up, it says, in a small cohort of normal elderly individuals, a mild increase in CBF, which is cerebral blood flow, is found in the left parietal occipital after EGB, which just stands for Ginkgo biloba, as well as a small but statistically significant increase in global cerebral blood flow. This is pretty impressive stuff. I also want to read another excerpt from a different abstract that talks about basically Ginkgo biloba's ability to improve cognitive function in a variety of ways. Here we go. Ginkgo biloba extract is increasingly used to alleviate symptoms of age-related cognitive impairment, with preclinical evidence pointing to a pro-cholinergic effect, right? What we talked about before, right? While a number of behavioral studies have reported improvements to working memory associated with GBE, or Ginkgo biloba extract, electrophysiological studies of GBE have typically been limited to recordings during a rested state. The current study investigated the chronic effects of GBE on steady-state visually evoked potential topography in 19 healthy middle-aged male participants while completing an object working memory task. A randomized double-blind crossover design was employed in which participants were allocated to receive 14 days GBE and 14 days placebo in random order. For both groups, steady-state visually evoked potential was recorded from 64 scalp electrode sites during the completion of an object working memory task, both pre and 14 days post-treatment. Ginkgo biloba extract was found to improve behavioral performance on the working memory task. GBE was also found to increase the steady-state visually evoked potential amplitude at occipital and frontal sites and increase steady-state visually evoked potential latency at left temporal and left frontal sites during the hold component of the working memory task. These changes associated with GBE may represent more efficient processing during working memory task completion. So needless to say, Ginkgo has some pretty interesting properties and statistically significantly improves working memory, which is actually a great segue into the next thing I want to talk about, which is that Ginkgo biloba is a natural nootropic. I love smart drugs, the actual pharmaceutical ones like oxiracetam I've been like totally obsessed with lately, and aniracetam I've liked for quite some time. But I also have a strong affinity for compounds that you already make in your brain that are synthesized from food or are intrinsic. I mean, that's the basis for the Cortex nootropic stack, right? Two of the main ingredients in that stack you make in your brain and are major components of parts of the functionality of the human brain. I think that you have to think about mental optimization, cognitive optimization in general from the standpoint of looking at what underlies the brain's function as it is and seeing if you can optimize those things. I mean, I also believe in bringing outside chemicals in, like in the case of the racetams, oxiracetam and aniracetam specifically for how they work on acetylcholine receptors, among other things, right? Because there's a place for that stuff. There's certainly a place for that stuff, and it works very well. But I also think that if you're really going to try to optimize the brain in a major way, you have to look at how the brain already optimizes itself. You have to look at the brain in an optimal state and see if you can mirror that. Because a brain, through the various things that we subject ourselves to throughout the day, like stress, will deteriorate in those ways, in the ways that make it normally function optimally. And so trying to find a way to restore that stuff is really one of the main targets of the Cortex nootropic stack, and I think should be an ideal target for people creating any type of nootropic, especially natural nootropics. And another thing from the perspective of actually making and selling the stack, the legality of selling racetams in a stack in the United States is a bit of a creepy gray area, although maybe by popular demand there will be a future Cortex generation that launches that has one of the racetams in it, and it just might be oxiracetam, so prepare your brains for that. But there's a contingent of people out there that look at natural nootropics as really the only way to take nootropics, and they really see smart drugs, they kind of group smart drugs into that category of super stimulants like Adderall. They look at modafinil as sort of the commonly recited one, and that turns a lot of people off. I had this conversation with two really great guys, a guy named Martin King from somewhere in the UK and Jorge Barba. The title of this podcast, it's a video podcast, and we recorded an audio podcast. It's called The Truth About Smart Drugs, where these guys basically just asked me their questions concerning this stuff. They talked about how generally nootropics are seen as drugs, and I think like one of the things that Jorge, one of the guys that I was talking to on the podcast, mentioned is like, I try to, he's like saying that I try to get myself into a state of flow kind of naturally. I don't need a drug to do that. And people think of it that way. It's like you're going to take a drug and suddenly you're going to be in this place where everything you touch becomes gold, and where functionally, in terms of productivity, you're going to just be rocking it. And so that connotation kind of leaves people feeling sort of weird about nootropics in general. And so Ginkgo biloba can really come in there and sort of provide a relief for those people in that it is as natural as they get when it comes to a nootropic. And if you scour the web and scour YouTube and search for Ginkgo biloba, you'll find a wide range of people using the substance every day, from medical doctors to naturopaths to people that you know and trust that wouldn't probably otherwise take actual pharmaceutical smart drugs like oxiracetam or aniracetam. So compounds like Ginkgo biloba are actually what a lot of people mean when they talk about nootropics in the traditional sense. We're really not talking about modafinil. We're definitely not talking about Adderall and or Ritalin. Some people might be talking about caffeine. I would say that, based on caffeine's mechanisms, I would consider it a nootropic, yerba mate as well. But we're really not talking about some of the widely covered, widely publicized compounds that people like to group into the area of smart drugs, which actually gives it a very negative connotation and sort of sets up the industry in general, if you want to call nootropics and smart drugs an industry, for failure from the perspective of the outside eye. Because it's more compounds like Ginkgo biloba, like uridine monophosphate, like artichoke extract, like alpha-GPC, like CDP choline. It's more compounds like that that we're really talking about that the brain might make itself or synthesize from food, or could be major components of cell membranes in the human brain, or major precursors to neurotransmitters, or could be plant-based compounds that have profound effects, documented profound effects on influencing one or more neurotransmitter systems in the brain to improve functionality from baseline. So rest assured, Ginkgo falls into that category. It is pretty much as natural as a nootropic can get, and as far as I can tell, there really aren't many side effects. Now, I want to quick talk about some experimentation that I did with Ginkgo biloba in taking no other nootropics for a few weeks and simply taking just Ginkgo. At the time, my diet was sort of a general plant-based diet with the exception of salmon as my protein that I ate twice a day. I was eating 2 pieces of salmon a day, so my brain was working pretty well due to the DHA and the EPA, the omega-3 fatty acids coming from the salmon. But I eat salmon every day anyway. So that's kind of like just the baseline that my brain is sort of always functioning at, considering that I've got adequate levels of EPA and DHA. And choline, by the way, because, salmon is a great source of choline. But what I essentially did was took 60 milligrams of Ginkgo biloba in the morning every day for 2 weeks. At that time, I really want to say that that was the time where I had some of the most stable brain function I've had in quite some time. I'm always like, something's always happening where I can't sleep enough, or I worked myself to the bone or something. It puts me in a place where I'm stressed out or something and have to like sleep more, or whatever the case may be. I'm just kind of working all the time, so it's like, I don't rest as much as I should. During this time when I was taking the Ginkgo biloba, not only was my brain function awesome, my verbal fluency was awesome, my working memory was awesome, basically every facet of my brain function was really awesome, but also I felt generally super stable. There's a kind of degree of stability you feel when neurotransmitters are in a good place and you feel totally balanced, and I gotta say, taking Ginkgo biloba really made me feel that balance, and it felt pretty good. One of the interesting elements of Ginkgo biloba for me during that experiment and throughout the other times that I've taken it is its enhancement on my speed of processing. Now, there's no science to back this up, and I'm not going to cite any. This is just my own anecdotal experience. But I got to say, my speed of processing works a lot better when I take Ginkgo biloba. And I suspect that that has to do with sort of all the mechanisms that are taking place here. You've got the enhancement of the cholinergic system via creating more acetylcholine in the prefrontal cortex and preserving acetylcholine signaling in the brain. You've also got that mild inhibition of the acetylcholinesterase enzyme, and you've also got increases in dopamine concentrations in the striatum and in the prefrontal cortex. I mean, that right there is a nootropic stack. I mean, Ginkgo with all the flavonoids and the bilobalide. This is a nootropic stack, essentially, in one herb. That's why this plant is so awesome. That's why, if you've done your research and it works out for you, you should give it a go, and that's why we totally recommend taking Ginkgo. Now, I wouldn't really say that you could take this or you should take this with a bunch of other nootropics, because I am generally under the impression that less is definitely more when it comes to nootropics. I mean, that's what I've come to experience over the past 6 years in experimenting, and then taking that 1.5 years to build the Cortex stack. Less is definitely more. So you may not want to mix this with cholinergics or dopaminergics or anything else. Now, you may get an amazing benefit if you've got your finger on the dial and you can kind of meticulously work on improving a particular neurotransmitter system that that Ginkgo biloba is also working on at the same time to further optimize the brain. Like understanding that it increases acetylcholine concentrations, you might take it with like a titch of alpha-GPC, or you might take Ginkgo biloba with a titch of huperzine A. I'd never really suggest people go high on huperzine A. That's an inhibitor of the acetylcholinesterase enzyme. You should probably only take between 30 and 100 micrograms at least to start to see where you're at, but that might not be a bad idea, and you might get some impressive brain function as a result of it. You might take Ginkgo with a little bit of CDP choline, something like 20 to 100 milligrams of CDP choline. You might stack uridine monophosphate in 120 milligram quantities, or between 100 and 200 milligram quantities, whatever works for you, and CDP choline between 20 and 40 milligram quantities and 60 milligrams in Ginkgo biloba, and you might get a very interesting effect, because those two, CDP and uridine, in those quantities have a profound effect on the cholinergic system, and is somewhat, there's different quantities, we're not divulging that quite yet, but it is somewhat close to the quantities of those ingredients in the Cortex stack. One might get an increased dopaminergic effect by taking Ginkgo biloba and maybe something like L-tyrosine, which is a precursor to the 3 major neurotransmitters collectively called the catecholamines: dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. And dopamine is heavily involved in the motivation reward system in the brain. I don't think it's safe to say that you can take a racetam with Ginkgo biloba, because Ginkgo biloba is is really not providing a choline source, although it does increase concentrations of acetylcholine. It's not actually providing raw material to build acetylcholine, so you still want to take a choline source with aracetam if you're going to take ginkgo. An interesting stack might be ginkgo biloba and aracetam and some CDP choline or some choline bitartrate, depending on what you can put up with. Some people really can't do CDP choline at large quantities, and choline bitartrate works perfectly for them in the realm of taking racetams. That might be an interesting stack, but I guess the thing to watch out for, just as a caveat, if you were to think about that, is that aniracetam, as an example, increases blood flow to the brain, and so does ginkgo biloba. You might not want to crank the lever on the vasodilation for various purposes. But overall, like I said, I think that ginkgo can sort of be taken by itself and seems to be quite effective in that fashion. So summing it up, ginkgo biloba has the ability to increase acetylcholine in the prefrontal cortex, as well as dopamine in the prefrontal cortex and in the striatum. It has the ability to prevent beta-amyloid neuronal loss on the brain. Beta-amyloid is the sort of major component that underlies Alzheimer's disease, the beta-amyloid plaques that build up in the brain, preventing the brain from functioning normally. Ginkgo biloba is neuroprotective, and just like the racetams, helps prevent amnesia due to scopolamine, which is a cholinergic antagonist. It has a bunch of different flavonoids, probably 20, but 3 of them might be at play here. They are quercetin, camphorol, and isohamnitin. Then ginkgo biloba has neuronal regenesis abilities, or the ability to help the brain repair itself at a large scale in the form of nerve repair. Very impressive stuff. It's like a multifaceted nootropic right here, and I gotta say, having experimented with it for a while and taken it consistently, I really love this herb.
Ginkgo biloba for the win.
Alright, I wanted to end the podcast in highlighting another person in the nootropics community that's providing some pretty awesome content out there that always talks about biohacking and kind of quantified self stuff, but a lot of nootropic stuff lately, and his name is Steve Cronin. Steve Cronin! Check him out on YouTube. Just go to YouTube and search for Steve Cronin. You will see all his videos. A lot of them are reviews about popular nootropics. There are reviews about nootropic stacks that are pre-made. There are reviews about nootropic powders, nootropic companies, individual nootropics sent to him by various companies. So you kind of get to see like which companies, like whether it's New Star or Smart Powders or insert other company that he likes and that might be awesome and beneficial for you to do business with as well. And generally, Cronin has a lot of awesome energy, and that's very cool to have somebody talking about nootropics in a positive light. He also defended the nootropics community when the BBC did basically an erroneous video, was 17 minutes long, called My Smart Drugs Nightmare, where this guy took modafinil, had some performance benefits from it, got wakefulness and capacity to be extra productive, but was having some sleep issues among other things, and decided to do this whole thing called My Smart Drugs Nightmare, which, by the way, kind of grouped every smart drug, natural nootropics included, into that same category. It has 177,000 views at this point, and will in fact influence people to look at the entire realm of nootropics in a negative light, when we're literally talking about a grain of sand in the beach compared to the rest of the nootropics. And we're talking about modafinil, which is an anti-narcolepsy drug. It's not a nootropic in my mind and a lot of other people's minds, nor is it really a smart drug in the traditional sense, and so it's very misleading. But Cronin defended us with a video that talks about basically all of those points and more, and you can find that by searching for My Smart Drugs Nightmare, R-E with a colon, My Smart Drugs Nightmare, or just My Smart Drugs Nightmare, and Steve Cronin. Shout out to Mr. Cronin. That's coming up. For those of you who have not tried the Cortex nootropic, give it a shot and snag yourself a bottle. The stack has successfully penetrated the nootropics community. It's very early. It only just launched February 20th. It's been out for just short of a month, but people are reacting really well to it. We've gotten nothing but positive reviews about the stack so far, and I'm going to read you one from a guy named Jared Shiro, whose title to his review was Impressed. It goes like this: most nootropics are subtle, not Cortex. I spend about 4 hours a day reading from textbooks at college, and when taking Cortex, all the information seems to be easier to understand, and my focus throughout is far more enhanced. I literally don't want to stray off what I'm working on. It's different than caffeine. I actually feel my mind working better. Great product, guys. Worth your money, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Shiro. Appreciate that review. And you can snag a bottle of the Cortex stack, a 30 count, at livecortex.com. It'll be shipped to you in days. Our stack combines uridyl monophosphate, CDP choline, artichoke extract, and Bacopa monnieri in a very synergistic way. The main focus of the stack is to promote focus endurance, memory, chiefly verbal fluency, and all-around productivity. The major benefit people that are taking Cortex are getting is energy in their brains to do more work. That's why it's called workhorse. They have the capacity to engage in things. They want to engage in things. This is both a cholinergic and a dopaminergic stack, so people have the capacity to function really well when taking Cortex and also super motivated to do work to function well when taking Cortex. It's awesome. Otherwise, if you have not subscribed to our channel on YouTube, go to YouTube and find us by searching Live Cortex Nootropics channel or podcast. Check out some of our videos of me talking about my various interests around nootropics, my experience with nootropics, my philosophy about smart drugs and nootropics. And if you're on iTunes listening to this podcast, please review the podcast and or subscribe, or maybe both if you're so inclined to, which would be really awesome. And remember to sign up for the email list on the livecortex.com blog so that we can send you at the end of the week all the links for all the content we created, because I got to tell you, I'm going crazy with content creation and there's going to be a lot of it. All right, thanks for coming, everybody. It's been my pleasure to serve you. I really appreciate the fact that you took the time to listen to this podcast. I mean, it means a lot to me, really. And hey, until next time, we'll talk to you.
Pick up a bottle of the Cortex Nootropic at www.livecortex.com.